Hello everyone, Chober here, and we're here with some first thoughts on Call of Duty Modern Warfare, the new Call of Duty coming out this fall. The first open beta exclusive to PS4 was just this past weekend, and there was a lot of talk around town about the game, both good and bad. And since this is a series dear to my heart, I wanted to share some of my own thoughts as well. You have no idea how excited I am to be making a video about Call of Duty because this game and this series really as a franchise has been really close to me on multiple different levels. Call of Duty was one of the first games that really got me into online gaming on the regular, starting with Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare actually, and eventually it paved my way into an amateur client on PC back in the day before the main community migrated to consoles. Black Ops 3 was when I first played on consoles, where I got to work briefly on the Call of Duty World League with ESL. And while I always had a lot of respect for pros on sticks, yeah, that was a rude awakening. Anyway, since then, I've been invested on the console, and even if I didn't work any events, and it's a game I've kept up with both on the esports end and casual end as well, as a player myself. Now, it should be noted that my viewpoints, in general across all games, not just Call of Duty, tend to be this weird middle ground between hardcore competitive and then also casual, so keep that in mind as you're watching this video. A lot of it comes from the fact that I used to have the time and energy to invest into just grinding games out, and now I just don't, so these are thoughts from a washed up core gamer, and maybe that's what we'll call my thoughts from now on. Well, first things first, overall I enjoyed the beta a ton. Love it or hate it, you can't deny that the pace of the game is much slower than the last few iterations of Call of Duty, and that's a big personal preference win for me. It's not just because I think it gives me a better chance in pubs, which it does, but personally I think it adds just a bit more tension even in pubs, and to some extent from a viewer experience as well when you're watching competitive games. Generally, I like the aesthetics. I think the game looks pretty great, although I do have some heavy qualms that have already been brought up by others to great extent, so we'll talk more about those in detail later in the video. The gameplay mechanics took some getting used to, and the gunplay feels and sounds really good in my opinion, as it's got a good punch both in terms of recoil and audio feedback, but there were a couple points that I was confused about, and also a couple small complaints that I'll touch upon towards the end of this video. Now that we've covered the basics, let's start diving into things. Returning to the first point then, the pacing and the flow of the game. Since, as I mentioned, my introduction to Call of Duty was the original Modern Warfare, and with a heavy focus into pro mod and hardcore lobbies in later titles, this actually felt pretty familiar. The time to kill isn't to the point where it's anti-fun for a lot of people, but it's still quick enough that your choices have consequences, and you can't rely on movement alone to take risks. It's either have cover in mind or get punished. Of course, the greatest topic all weekend wasn't really about any of that, it was actually the minimap, and before we go into any discussion, it should be noted that Infinity Ward responded and experimented with multiple different levels of changes, the last of which is shown in this video. So let's recap what the changes are. First of all, there is a minimap with your teammates on it, as you can see on the screen. Second, you do not see enemy gunfire showing up on the minimap unless you have streaks going. You do still see them show up as red dots on your compass, so that hasn't changed. And third, they actually removed the X-ray for teammates, so you don't see them through the walls, you only see them on your minimap. Now that we've covered those changes, I don't mean to dig up skeletons of the past, but as these were still just experiments, here were my initial thoughts that I wanted to share. Now, I mentioned I used to play hardcore lobbies heavily in the past, so quite frankly, when I first booted up the beta, I didn't even really notice that the minimap was gone. And I don't mean that I never look at the minimap, I think it just never really registered as a bad or new change. It was just a type of game that I used to always play. However, I totally get the complaints on multiple different levels. For me, removing the minimap felt like this wishy-washy commitment to making Modern Warfare a quote-unquote military sim, but meanwhile, you can still see your teammates' exact locations through walls if you wanted. If they had made it with no X-ray and just the dots on the compass, like it or not, I actually would have probably defended the decision, as it's a very clear intent on redefining the series for better or worse. But this wasn't that. That's not what we got in the beta. What we got was a weird middle ground where some levels of it were changes towards a military sim, and then other levels were still hey, we want to make sure that you have this information so that it plays like a Call of Duty, and they just didn't really mix very well. And those of you guys who know me know that I generally tend to stand on the side of benefit of the doubt if there's clear intent. So let's say there was an intention to redefine the series, right, and make it just a lot more realistic. Maybe it doesn't feel good, maybe we don't like it, but I would sit there and say, okay, they clearly intended this, and it shows in their decisions, so I'm going to give it a shot for as long as I can. This, what we got in the beta initially, wasn't that. It was a weird commitment that was halfway and didn't mix very well. The last iteration, again shown in this video, felt like a much better commitment to what they wanted this Modern Warfare to be, which I'm gonna believe was still Call of Duty, but with a little bit more tension and maybe decision making. In my opinion, from this point on, maybe change the personal radar, which is the first streak you can get, to something like an echo radar that only catches non-suppressed gunfire for the whole team, while the UAV returns to its normal self, or stays as its normal self rather, where it shows everyone on a timed basis. Who knows? Maybe we'll see more changes in the next open beta. I am curious if they're going to revert to the original version for the other platforms to test out as well, because the next beta is across all platforms, but we'll have to wait a couple days for that. Also, it should be noted that without the minimap, it is going to take people much longer to learn the maps, because I highly doubt the majority of casual players bother opening up and studying the full map in any Call of Duty. So, something maybe that none of us considered is that the minimap actually gives some indirect education to your surroundings that you end up piecing together, whereas if you didn't have the minimap, you're probably trying to learn the map and just getting frustrated because you're really just running the same paths over and over again. Now with that out of the way, which was the big elephant in the room all weekend, there was also quite a bit of talk about camping. Some of you probably feel like I'm playing a super campy style in this video, and at times I am because I suck. But trust me, you haven't seen camping until you've played a 4v4 hardcore team deathmatch with ranking points on the line. That is the slowest Call of Duty I have ever played. Anyway, Call of Duty is this weird game where there's a huge variance between the most common casual player base and then the cream of the crop. And I mean huge, probably more so than almost any game in my opinion. And this is because it's not only about skill. If it's about skill level, there's plenty of games that have a huge variance, and that's generally how it should work. But it's also about the understanding and availability, actually, of communication, education, and overall strategy of the game. Which means I also think that Call of Duty is one of the hardest to balance and design in today's world. So what do? A go-to method of combating camping generally is with open map designs where there's all sorts of sight lines and entries, so you can't really stay in one place and expect to be able to cover all your bases. Now generally, I don't like it when there's too many corners and too many entrances. I know you need enough to ensure no one can hold a monopoly over an area, no questions asked. But some games and maps in the past have done it so much in the other direction that there's literally no point in the phrase holding an area. It's just not possible. So it is a little bit iffy, and for Call of Duty, it's an even grayer area because of all the different modes that play on every single map, because all of them have a very different objective and different pace. So Modern Warfare and what we've seen so far seems to offer enough where if you're annoyed by someone camping, there's usually another way around. There are some exceptions in modes like Domination, and I'm specifically looking at you, B Flag, and Azir Cave, but most areas in the beta actually had a lot of pathing choices without feeling too overwhelmed. Closest it got to being a little too crazy was Grozny Raid. That's the destroyed city map with holes in every single wall in the middle of town. And while that did make Grozny Raid my least favorite map of the beta, it wasn't to the point where I wanted to say I'm done with this and move on. So overall, I think the design is probably okay. I can't obviously speak on the competitive end because I don't play at that level, but while usually not feasible in this time frame and generally not a great idea, if map changes were a possibility, Grozny Raid would be on my list, but otherwise I'm okay with most of the other maps. The one in the video that we're watching, Gunrunner, was probably my favorite alongside Hackney Yard, and then Azir Cave third, and Grozny Raid last in the beta for me. However, on the same note of camping, there's definitely a problem with lighting, and this is a weird discussion for me. I love the look of the new Call of Duty. I think it's both lush but gritty at the same time, which I just love that aesthetic, right? And it works really well for what Call of Duty Modern Warfare is supposed to be in terms of the environment and the story, but there are times where I can be staring at a window, just straight at it, and the enemy is moving, they're strafing across the window, and I still can't see them. And I don't think it's a brightness issue, because I generally play at a higher brightness than most people. It really actually seems to be either a contrast issue, or an issue with how light rays work through openings, but I'm not an expert on that realm, so I can't offer any more options. But what I really want to say is that it is pretty rough, and I agree with everyone who's talked about it. It's been mentioned multiple times, and I think it's a change that needs to happen. It's okay for it to be a little bit harder to see through certain windows or doors because of how the lighting should be, but if it's just actually impossible to spot them unless you hold long enough to see their nameplate, that's a problem in my opinion, and it needs to change. As for certain head glitch spots, annoying, but the headshot multiplier seems to balance it out somewhat, so I'll hold off on that even if my aim is bad. There are probably a couple that can be abused too much, and we'll see about that once the next beta comes around, and of course once the full game is released. Now moving on into gameplay and mechanics, the guns feel different enough, and also generally require a lot of tweaking on either attachments or playstyle to make them work. It's a small sample size, so I won't go crazy about it, but the game felt completely different from when I first started to this video, where I had all the options available for the M13, which coincidentally became my favorite in the beta. And to say that you have a favorite means that there were enough differences. Anyway, the AK is a monster to control, the SMGs can't hold a line long range, and all in all, it feels pretty good. Generally, I think ARs are going to rule the game, especially with the slower pacing, but we'll see once we have more choices and attachments. There are a few things I'm confused about though, and additionally some that I'm a little bit miffed about. As for confusion, I'm not entirely sure yet how to utilize the tactical sprint. It's the new sprint that's in here where you can double tap sprint to get a faster sprint, but in fact I didn't know exactly what it was as I hadn't watched any of the gameplay prior to this beta. Maybe I just glanced over it and ignored it, but I don't recall even being told within the game to double tap L3 for a faster sprint at the cost of longer sprint out times, and once I learned I'd try it, but it's very short without the perk, and with the cost of a longer sprint out time, I don't know if it's worth it to put a perk on it. Maybe in modes like capture the flag? I don't really know, and my biggest confusion is really I just wonder what their ideal intention was for this mechanic. It's okay if it's not to be used all the time or if it's not the greatest thing. I guess I just want to know so that I can make a choice on whether I want to use it or not. Another is the sliding, and this is more of a it's probably on me not knowing how to make this work very well. It's obviously not as powerful as sliding in the Black Ops series, but it's there nonetheless, and to get you a quick last duck and spurt into cover, it works pretty great. The confusion is that I've been on the receiving end of others who are still using it very effectively as an offensive option, and I just don't seem to get that range when going into doors or around corners. So if you have any ideas on what I might be doing wrong here, please let me know in the comments below. Last but not least, it's the doors. The doors, the frickin' doors, and this is my complaint. So, you can interact with doors, which is great. I think it's a cool option, and I think it's cool that we have multiple different ways to interact with them. The default, I think, is to hold to open and close doors. You can turn on the contextual tap to use, which means that you can tap square on PS4, and it will always prioritize using something if that's a choice. So if you're in front of a door, it will open the door instead of reloading. If that suits you, that's great. For me, I tried it. I thought I would like it. I hated it because I reload all the time. But then the third option is you can sprint into doors and they will automatically bash them open. This is all great. It's really cool. It gives you options to interact with the environment and the map. Now, the problem is that the doors get stuck and in weird ways. So one is, I mentioned that you can sprint to doors to open them. The problem is that if a door is open, I think sometimes you can just walk into it or right by it, and then it will close. So then the problem becomes if you're sprinting into a door and then let's say your teammate's sprinting with you ahead of you, they open the door and then they walk back into it, it tries to close the door, but then you're stuck halfway through and then you have to interact with the door to open it again. And there's other times where I'll be walking by a door and it will just slam shut because I kind of grazed it, I guess, with my elbow, and it's making noise that I didn't want it to. So that's one where I think maybe just the interaction with the range, or just something in terms of whether you're sprinting or not, checking that option needs to be double checked. The other problem comes when there's someone or something on the other side that's blocking the door. So obviously initially the intention is that there is collision and that the door doesn't swing open. That's fine, I get it. But then, now the door's confused on whether it's opening or closing, so when you try to interact with it again, it starts going back and forth. And I just put up the clip from earlier in the video, and actually watching it again, if if the devs were to tell me that it is intended that doors get jammed, I'll take it, right? Again, I'm all about intention. So fine, I'll take it, but otherwise it's very inconsistent, and it should be fixed, hopefully, for release, so that there's no confusion nor accidental frustration as we're playing through the game. Well, that's it for my thoughts. I know there's a lot we didn't cover, but mostly that's because we haven't been able to dissect them or experiment with them enough yet in the first open beta, so we'll keep an eye out for them in open beta weekend 2 and of course the game's release. That's it for my thoughts. Let me know what you guys thought if you got to play the open beta on PS4 down in the comments below, and if you haven't, let me know what you're looking forward to for open beta weekend 2 when we're going to have some crossplay. So I'll see you guys all online in a couple days.